mode.
Hi there, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on adapting student and teacher practices for the new science standards. My name is Francis Vigent, and I'm CEO here at KnowAtom, but I'm also a former teacher. I spent close to 10 years teaching elementary, middle school, and high school STEM classes, and as a public educator in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And our webinar today is going to be talking a lot about how and why these shifts in student and teacher practices are happening under the new standards, and what concrete steps we as educators can take to adjust teaching and learning expectations. And a big piece of this presentation is going to focus in two areas. One, why the shifts, and two, what those shifts are going to look like in standardized testing, at least as best as we have an indicator from states who have gone operational, as well as the recommendations from Achieve. So with that said, I'd like to jump right in here and point out, sort of frame things in terms of the context for change with this quote from Angela Duckworth from a popular book that many educators have read or are reading presently called Grit. And the quote is this: it's, "For the beginner, novelty is anything that hasn't been encountered before. For the expert, novelty is nuance." And one of the challenges, and the reason I put this out here right now, is that as people are looking to these new standards, they are oftentimes beginners in their understanding of what the new standards represent, what it means to teach and learn in a three-dimensional context. Something that's not only content, but in fact skills and systems thinking combined, in order to develop students to a point where they can perform the expectations of a standard, which is a performance expectation itself, with habits that they've built, with these skills. And so what's happening right now, and the reason I bring this up, is that folks will see things like e-textbooks and 3D printers, or some kind of anything that's on a computer, let's say, and think that, oh, this must be next generation because we've never done that before. And the reality is it's kind of a shiny thing. And because many people are in this beginning understanding, basically what they haven't encountered before seems to be like the answer, and that's everything and anything called next generation. The reality, though, is that these next generation standards really take quite a bit of understanding in order to design curriculum specifically to meet the needs of skills, content, and systems thinking in a way that is not only developing storylines, but is nurturing children from September through June and from one grade level to the next in such a way that that students are developing skills and content knowledge together. And so the role of teachers and students is fundamentally changing, and that's lost on a lot of folks who are not operating at that level. And I would just encourage you, as you go through this process, to really think deeply about the differences between the prior standards and the new standards. And on top of it, when you look at resources that claim to be next generation science resources, looking at the nuance, what is fundamentally different? Just because something is in a computer or is called STEM, or it's whatever, it doesn't mean anything. And the reality is, and we see this with KnowAtom an awful lot, is that the reality is that there are many small nuances that set next generation instruction and expectations and curriculum apart from traditional, but they're important. And unfortunately, folks who are at a beginner level oftentimes overlook these important things because they're kind of glammed by something shiny. So buyer beware, and also beware of nuance, and ask good questions as best you can, and learn how these new standards are shifting away from older methods of teaching and learning. So with that in mind, I want to jump right into why do student and teacher practices really shift in these next generation science classrooms. The primary reason has to do with these science and engineering practices. These are a single dimension that affect every single standard in every single grade level, and they are something that evolve from kindergarten all the way through grade 12. And they're not just evolving in terms of their depth and complexity in terms of how students express them and are engaged in them, but they are skills which students are developing in kindergarten and which are evolving in their complexity within the student. And they're able to demonstrate that by being able to apply those skills in more nuanced and deeper, more complex scenarios. And so many educators would look at this list and say, oh, well, we plan experiments, or we ask questions, or I help students obtain, evaluate, communicate information. And just in that sort of exchange that we often have with educators, it's not about whether I as the educator do it or we do it. It's whether the student has developed the skill and is able to call on that skill as a habit, kind of like a habit of mind or a habit of thinking, in order to develop a problem or a question which they have identified or developed to an evidence-based conclusion. So this is really, I would say, the number one reason that the old way of business in most traditional classrooms doesn't work anymore, and why you need to be very attuned to what is really next generation versus what is called next generation curriculum and instruction. One of the things I would point to is, and you can see that in this picture, what's on this student's desk. It's not just materials. It's not just some hands-on thing. It's not inquiry. And this is a KnowAtom classroom, or a teacher using KnowAtom materials in their classroom. What the purpose of these materials are is for that student to engage in what we call investigative phenomena, so that that class can start with real life anchor phenomena, things like, dog sled races and hurricanes and flooding and, any of these sort of things which are real life occurrences that are complex, which we can't replicate in its entirety in our classrooms because the variables are too many and too complex. Students can begin to ask questions or identify problems in those complex phenomena, and then through discussion and through planning, access pieces of that complex anchor phenomena in experiments and prototyping. And that is what brings some of that phenomena to life in front of their eyes, right in front of them at their desk with their partner. And so that's why we call it investigative phenomena, because it's an investigation into some element of an anchor phenomena, which, yes, is a kind of inquiry in materials, it may be hands-on, and so on. But the bottom line is that it's investigative phenomena. It's an opportunity to try to answer a question or solve a problem through prototyping, through experimentation, through a student's own ideas. Okay, so that's key. And as I mentioned, that requires a plan. So you'll notice on the student's desk, it's not just materials, but there is a plan which they developed with their partner. Their partner must be sitting to their side over here. And when a student is being set up to experience investigative phenomena, they can't just pull out materials and start putting things together. They need to be thoughtful. They need to really think through and be intentional. And they need to invest their thinking in what they hope to learn. And they do that by creating some type of investigative plan, whether it's in a scientific or an engineering context. And that plan gives relevance to those materials. And that's how the materials will ultimately yield some data which is useful to trying to answer a question or solve a problem. The other thing is that this type of environment is the basis for many formative assessments. It's an opportunity for that teacher to understand or gain insight into that student's thinking. And by doing so, it gives that teacher insight into their instruction. How is that student interpreting the expectations? How are they applying the vocabulary? How are they understanding the role of problems or questions and plans and experiments, and even the role of materials, collecting data, application of math practices, all of that. That teacher's gaining insight into all of these different aspects of that student's learning. And on the flip side, they're able to gather that feedback many times at many different opportunities, which are structured or unstructured. And that helps that teacher understand how effective their instruction is. Basically looking at the student like a mirror. As a teacher, I think I set these expectations, but has the student really understood that? Have they internalized it? Do I need to clarify, or do I need to redirect the entire class? So that's one thing. On the student side, and that's helpful in the moment, by the way. What this teacher learns now, she can use with the student in the moment and with their entire class in the moment. So it's not something that's, learn about in 6 months when we take a standardized science test for the state. On the flip side, this student has that same sort of thing going on. What they're doing is they're taking their ideas and they are presenting those to the teacher in different forms. They're answering, higher order questions for that teacher. They are reflecting on what they're doing and how they're doing it, and they are, talking about the problem that they've identified. They're talking about the facts that are relevant to that question or problem. They're talking about their hypothesis, their procedure for actually using specific materials, and what materials those are, and what information they hope to gather, and so on. And so through that process, they're not only reflecting on their thoughts and on their methods, but they are gaining insight from the teacher as the teacher asks them higher order questions in sort of a Socratic method. They are gaining feedback which is useful to them in the moment. For example, if they can't explain how a fact is relevant to the problem or question, then that may be an area where they need to think a little more deeply. Or if, as they're talking about a procedure that they're going to use, they start to realize that there are materials or tools which they require that they haven't accounted for, or vice versa. Maybe they don't require certain things that they included in their materials. So that's an opportunity for them to go right away and use the information through this sort of dialogue and reflection to improve how they do their work and how they understand what it means to be someone who learns well in a science class in that moment. So this type of environment is something that the next generation science standards, or whether you're from an adaptive or an adoptive state, are designed for. They are intended for formative assessment. And when I get to the phase where we talk a bit about standardized testing and how that's changing at a state level for most, actually really all adoptive states or adaptive states in some form, what that's going to look like if your state hasn't gone operational, it can give you an idea around that, but it looks very formative. And if you're from a state that has enacted PARC testing or some form of PARC-like testing in ELA, it's very similar. So formative assessment. I generally tell people you should be looking for 80 to 90% formative assessment and 10% summative assessment, because really everything that's valuable that students and teachers can learn from and take action on in the moment, which is what's most important, comes from the formative assessment. Summative assessment is much less valuable to both parties. The last piece that is something that folks are struggling with and that you should be aware of in this shift is that these students are authentically planning. And so authentic plans result in unique approaches because it is, this student and his partner's ideas and, this student and her partner's ideas that result in the plans that they are carrying out here. Ideas are different. approaches are different. Therefore, results oftentimes are different in absolute terms, but even in conclusions. And so that's part of the magic of these new standards and the release of responsibility that's required in the student-centered instruction that occurs in these next generation science standards, is that students come to different conclusions, and that provides the basis for further thinking and argumentation. So you can imagine in a class, this student and his partner create a plan, they go through that, they gather data hands-on, they are into into the investigative phenomena, and they come to an evidence-based conclusion. This team goes through a similar process with different ideas, different approaches, results in different data. They may come to the same conclusion, even though they have different data, or they may come to a different conclusion based on the data that they have. Now, during debrief, in that Socratic sort of model of debrief, these teams can then say, well, we identified similar problems or similar questions. However, we came to entirely different conclusions and we had entirely different data. Why did that happen? Whose claim is really supported by the evidence, or how did these differences in evidence occur? Was there human error? So on and so forth. So again, back to the nature of these new standards, if students are learning in 3 dimensions like this, teachers are going to have to make a shift from a traditional model of instruction where a teacher is that one delivering content and students are trying to absorb it and mirror it back. That's not the case. This teacher is learning as an interested skeptic and trying to inform themselves about their practices and the student's understanding, and vice versa. The student is applying those same techniques to better understand their own learning, their own approach, and both party is sort of refining their actions in the moment. What does this look like in an actual classroom? So I'll use KnowAtom as an example. We take that anchor phenomena, that complex piece that can't be replicated in the classroom, and we get students familiar with it through video, audio, nonfiction reading, and we allow that to be the basis for students to become dissatisfied with the questions and problems that they're seeing and the fact that they would like to know more to be able to answer those questions, more to be able to solve those problems. And those questions and problems that they identify become the basis of Socratic dialogue. And so students are trained to think like scientists and engineers and to use Socratic talk in the same method that you use accountable talk in classrooms, and train students to think like that. And what happens is that students raise their own questions and problems and ideas within that anchor phenomena, and then they bring those to the group and they further refine them through Socratic dialogue, and then they leave with some questions and some problems answered or solved, but they tend to have better refined problems or questions that are still out there, which they haven't been able to answer or solve, or which there's just not enough evidence or experience in the class. And so that gives them an opportunity to pursue a question through a scientific process or a problem through an engineering process in order to engage in investigative phenomena, okay? To seek answers about some aspect of that anchor through a hands-on investigation. So that's how we do it in KnowAtom. And so students develop those plans, whether it's kindergarten or 4th grade or 5th grade or 8th grade. Now, obviously, the structure and complexity of that changes. This age appropriateness that is taken into consideration in all of this. But nonetheless, it is the same practices, and it's changing. Something that students are using as a tool to develop and use the content, to observe the cross-cutting concepts, and to attempt the skills and thereby develop mastery of those skills over time, because they don't just happen in a one-off. Okay, none of these standards and none of the dimensions can happen by, quote, covering a standard. You can't cover these standards. They're taught in clusters repeatedly in different contexts and vertically and horizontally integrated into really what should be your school system's approach to science K-12. So that investigative phenomenon and the result of that scientific process, as a student engages in it, gives them the evidence to form conclusions. And this is the key. They form those evidence-based conclusions using what they observe, the investigative phenomena, and they debrief, comparing with their peers. But the whole point of it is to reflect back on the anchor phenomena. So how do I better understand that complex situation, the hurricanes, the flooding, the fires, the tornadoes, better than I did at the beginning? How do I solve the problem of structures being weak, not standing up to hurricane force winds or things like this, erosion? I can take what I have learned, what I've observed, and the ideas that I started with and further refined and gathered evidence on to reflect on that. An example of this, let's think about flooding, for example. We could look at flooding somewhere in the world, like I always use New York City for some reason. So let's say that New York City, we look at flooding in New York City, could raise questions in a student's mind about how the type of material that makes up the ground in New York City allows or does not allow water to pass through, to percolate, or perhaps it absorbs water. So students may talk about their ideas, but they really have no evidence to back up what they think is the answer and how that may impact flooding during high rainfalls or large storms like Superstorm Sandy. So they could, together with their partner, look at a resource base and come up with a way to test some of these ideas. So they could look and say, well, we could take gravel, sand, soil, clay, and we could take a consistent amount of water and pass that through each of, multiple samples of each of those types of earth materials. And we could look at how much water is absorbed. We could look at how fast the water passes through, and we could look at how much water passes through over set periods of time. And we could gather that data to reflect on whether there's a difference resulting from the kind of material. We could even compare that material to the type of material that's found in the ground in different areas of New York City. So we could come to a conclusion about whether the ground impacts flooding, first of all, how it absorbs and if it absorbs water, how it allows water to pass through. And then we could infer from that data how similar materials in the ground may impact flooding. And then we could make a comparison to the kind of materials found in the ground in New York City to try again and infer whether or not that may be impacting flooding and how we could use that information maybe when we build buildings or redo roads or things like this, especially near the shoreline or other places, in order to resist flooding. Okay, so that in a nutshell is not only how KnowAtom works, but it's really how the Next Generation Science classroom works, and that's why we're designed for the Next Generation Science standards in these adaptive and adoptive states like California, Massachusetts, Colorado, Arkansas, and so on. And sometimes we have different versions for different states depending on the adaptation, or whether it's a straight adoption. But the bottom line is that in all cases, this is what the standards are designed for, whether or not they've been tweaked in some way, is this type of learning environment. And it's a shift away from what I referred to earlier as that traditional model where the teacher's a kind of content expert and that content flows through the teacher and the students are good listeners and observing the teacher's demonstration or an explanation. And, under previous standards, if the student was a good listener and could explain or recall or repeat what that teacher showed or demonstrated, they were considered proficient. But that's not enough anymore, okay? Because now students have to be able to demonstrate three-dimensional mastery. Three-dimensional mastery doesn't just mean hands-on. It means skills, content, and cross-cutting concepts, which are really systems thinking in terms of how one area of content relates to another through things like stability and change. Okay, there's no space for that in a traditional model. Where do students get the opportunity to actually develop a skill? A skill is not something that can be told to somebody. You can't tell somebody how to ride a bike. You can't tell somebody how to drive a car. They have to actually get out and do it in order to develop the skill, right? Books and explanations only get you so far, and not far enough. A next generation model changes the relationship between the student and the content. There's no longer a teacher that's in between, kind of parsing it out. Instead, what you have is a student who's attempting skills, who is raising themselves to the level of expectations that the teacher is setting, and in an environment where they have an opportunity to attempt to bring their own ideas to life, or to collaborate with a peer, a couple peers, to bring their ideas to life. And they do so by trying to take those skills and apply them to the content and cross-cutting concepts. Looking at anchor phenomena, asking questions, formulating ideas, developing a model, using that model to get other data, using the data to argue a point from the actual evidence that they gathered. Okay, that's what this next generation environment looks like, and the teacher's acting as a coach. They're helping that student understand what it means to engage appropriately. They redirect and monitor to make sure that the expectations are clear. And then also through that formative assessment, they're helping that student engage appropriately and refine their own ideas and their application, in a sense, of practices. So oftentimes we talk about it as a rearranged Bloom's taxonomy in this next generation science class, where creating, evaluating, and analyzing happen simultaneously. The lower order thinking skills are obviously necessary, but they're not enough. And if it's not apparent now, it needs to be that Bloom's taxonomy is not a kind of ladder that you climb, where students start by remembering, so that you do all your vocab first, and then you check for understanding, and then you ask them to apply. That's very much an old world traditional model of instruction. This next generation model of instruction is about connecting students with real world phenomena and then engaging them in the purpose through that, the purpose of learning, the evaluation and analysis of that real world phenomena, and creating the opportunity for them to create not only questions and identify problems, but to go about creating answers to those questions and solutions to those problems, which requires remembering, understanding, and applying. But we don't make that the focus. We make the creating, evaluating, and analyzing the focus, so that students have to call on these other lower order thinking skills as part of operating in a higher order thinking space. So, and this kind of rounding the corner towards the next phase. So why student and teacher practices shift in the next generation science standards? For students, it's because it's no longer about guessing what the teacher is thinking, or proficiency is not about guessing what the teacher's thinking on a fill in the blank or circle kind of assessment. It's not about remembering what they said or showed. It's about students forming an opinion that's based on limited information and being able to demonstrate the skills to advance their own opinion or the opinion of their team to an evidence-based claim through experimenting and prototyping. So the definition of what it means to learn well has changed. Similar to this shift that I showed in the diagram, for students, it's important to realize that they grew up most likely in the world of traditional expectations, especially if you're a 5th or an 8th grade teacher. So that's something that needs to change. They are going to expect everything to be direct instruction, but now direct instruction has lost all its value. Students need to be able to function independently in both their thoughts and their actions, and they need to be able to demonstrate the ability to develop and use scientific knowledge in order to solve nuanced problems and questions, and ones that are related perhaps to something that they have learned about or may know, but again, not the result of direct instruction. For teachers, the definition of what it means to teach well has changed. So similar to the students, what it means to learn well has changed. For teachers, what it means to teach well has changed. And I guess here a couple things to point out is that it's no longer about delivering content or covering standards. Even those terms just sort of put flags up right away when we work with communities, because it shows sort of that teacher as content deliverer mentality that's so entrenched. Teachers need to become adept at coaching their students to work with the students' own ideas and the ideas of others. That's really the crux of these new standards. And so I would point you towards a learning walk guide that we've developed for our clients, but we'll make it available to anybody who's on this webinar. This learning walk guide is something that we use to train teachers to support their peers in a train the trainer kind of model. And what we're doing is really helping teachers to think like principals. This is not an evaluative tool in the sense of, go in and evaluate a teacher and drop something into their file. What this is it's a tool for looking at three key pillars: learning about teacher practices, students' depth of learning, and the release of responsibility. And it's written, when you see here, focus of formative feedback, it's written from the perspective of, as I go into a classroom, I, a peer teacher, and sit down in the back, how do I put on the hat of a student? How do I put on the hat of the teacher? How do I put on the hat of the administrator? And what are key areas that I want to be looking at and focusing some feedback in a way that will help me to support my peer by presenting evidence of where progress is being made, and also evidence of potential stumbling blocks, so that I can work with them to help formulate some concrete steps to remove those stumbling blocks and ultimately improve instruction. So that's all, key things here to think about, and I would recommend this learning walk guide as a way to do that. And if you didn't catch it, this is where you can access it up here at that link. So key things to keep in mind, shifts for those teachers, why this is a big difference. Teachers no longer do curriculum. Curriculum is not a script. If you are working with a curriculum that's some kind of modular thing where any unit can go in any order, they can be shifted between grade levels, it's highly adaptable to your practices, that in and of itself, if you have a curriculum that adapts to your practices, then your curriculum is probably not next generation science designed. And the reason for that is that 99%, I would say 99.5% of educators need to change their practices in order to reach the level of instruction required by these new standards. So keep that in mind. Curriculum is not something that's scripted. Curriculum, and if you look at an example of KnowAtom curriculum, I'm not pitching KnowAtom here, but I'm trying to, since I have access to it, use what I know best and really what's been become the gold standard in many states. Curriculum should help teachers understand how to create the environment, and sort of, if you think about a roadway, what are the yellow and white lines on that roadway, but to still, it's not a script. Okay, it's not something that you're not allowed to pass other cars. That you need to consider that there are multiple lanes on the road, and so what you see is not the only possible outcome, but it's intended to support teachers in this transition and helping to visualize, coach, and set expectations with standards. So quality curriculum also develops multiple frameworks across all three dimensions in a context, starting with an anchor phenomena, but allowing that phenomena to drive teaching and learning through different phases. Okay. So if you're doing nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue, planning, students are carrying out their plans hands-on. They're gathering the data. They're then taking the data, doing evidence-based writing, completing those plans with evidence-based conclusions, and then taking those conclusions and referring back to their evidence, but also comparing them to their peers. That's what we're talking about in terms of students engaging in multiple frameworks, those three dimensions in standards relevant context. So that's what your curriculum that teachers are enacting and helping meet student needs through needs to be supporting the teacher, okay, to do that. Not some kind of module that can happen anywhere, anyhow, because it's not grade specific enough or not standard specific enough. The third piece is that teachers are no longer telling, but rather they're setting expectations and creating an environment where students work as scientists and engineers. And so all of this basically leads up to the fact that the definition of effective instruction has changed, and it's changed really dramatically. Effective instruction is no longer, and always run into, particularly, it seems to be middle school teachers in particular, who are very proud about the nuances between one definition of something or another, or a particular example that they like to use, and so on, which under prior standards became sort of like the badge of quality, is how much you as a teacher know and can tell students. These new standards, the measure of quality of an instructor or of a teacher, is whether they, and you can see it right here, whether they're able to capitalize on students' early interest and experiences, identify and build on what they know, they being the students, provide the students with experiences to engage the students in the skills, which are the practices of science, and sustain those student interest over time. And these bolded words, what's key here is that the bolded words, it's all about the student. It's all the student at the center. And the student is the driver, not the teacher. The teacher is now passive. Or passive may be too strong of a word, but they're in a much more passive role. Okay? And I'll try to exemplify this in this picture. Here, the teacher's in the active role, right? The students are in a passive role. This is a traditional classroom environment where teacher demonstrates, shows, explains, and then students go and repeat it for themselves. Well, what you see on the right is very different. So this is actually a classroom using KnowAtom curriculum. Again, not pitching a product, but just trying to point out how it's different. These students have engaged in observing real-life phenomena around cranes and simple machines and some of these sort of things in real life. Video, audio, nonfiction, reading material. They came up with questions. They had Socratic dialogue with their class. Those questions and ideas and problems they identified were refined. And now together as partners, they are trying to solve a problem that they've identified in a way that's unique to their team. Okay, it's their idea. Nobody has ever tried it before. No one's ever put that together before, at least as far as they know. And so their ideas aren't biased. They have to authentically engage in developing a plan and then carrying out that plan and using, that's the material set that they have to work with. And so it's their idea, they own it, and it's what they're interested in, it's what they're engaged in, it's the product of what they know, and it's sustaining their interest because this is unique to this particular lesson. When they get to the next lesson, it's going to take skills and content and so on and build further on it in different ways. Not in a way that a student who's out sick for a day or, joins the class in the middle of the year can't join up, but it just means that it gathers a richer context, and you can see how much more engaged and authentic this environment is versus this environment. If you'd like to see some more of how those changes, what's involved in some of these changes in a very kind of granular sense, you can go to knowatom.com/changes, and we have a document available for you there from Achieve that just sort of says, hey, you can see that science education now will, teachers are going to not going to be providing information to the whole class. Instead, science education is now going to involve students conducting investigations, solving problems, engaging in discussions, maybe with some teacher guidance, but that's it. Okay, so there's something there that's helpful to share with your educators. Big takeaway is that the teacher needs to allow space for students to attempt skills and thereby developing them. And this means that the teachers need to let go of common traditional practices, including demonstrations, teacher demonstrations, kind of the brain pop world of, animated things, teaching classes or relying on students, turn and talk where learning isn't visible, think, pair, share where learning isn't visible, and instead getting away from those vocabulary fact drills, overly scaffolded text, and putting the student in the driver's seat to work with each other and to try to observe, to collect data, and to present their ideas and have the teacher be the interested skeptic, listening, engaging in that formative assessment, providing some, pushback, feedback kind of a thing to cause the students to reflect. So students need to be empowered to work with their own ideas and to come up with their own conclusions and to really own that learning and own their ideas. So how do these changes, and like I said, that was the earliest section here, longest section in this sort of scope of things. I want to jump into how these changes result in positive student learning outcomes and to look at next generation style, state level standardized assessments. So really key here is that when a student is presented with a novel problem or question, that means that it's not the result of direct instruction. It might only be tangentially related, and it's going to be pulling on things that were used in different contexts, like skills, content knowledge from different areas, maybe life science, earth science, and physical science knowledge is needed all at the same time in order to engage an issue, solve a problem. Students need to be able to fall back on those frameworks of skills and knowledge, almost like a habit. And so, like I said earlier, next generation science instruction is all about developing the skills to work with one's own ideas and the ideas of others. So you could think about that anchor phenomena as presenting students with a reason to care, establishing a purpose, and really raising those why questions. Why is this happening? Why is this important? Why would some people need to really pay attention to this? Why would this impact the environment? Anyhow, so that's sort of where it starts. And this really replaces that old KWL type, model where forget KWL, why, how, what. Think about this as sort of the phases in a lesson, and a lesson's not just a day. Like if you look at one of those lessons that I was mentioning, you can go to KnowAtom.com/curriculum. You can download a sample from any grade level of our curriculum there. You'll see that a lesson is a group of experiences that take place over multiple days. A lesson is not just a single hour of one day. So once you have a reason to care, now you start to ask, well, how? How might we better understand the problems or questions that we're seeing come up here and, our own dissatisfaction with the fact that we care but can't solve this or really fully understand it yet. And that leads us to the what. What elements can we explore? How, what is it that we can gather? What is it we can do to better explore some element of this complex phenomena and better understand the problem or questions, or perhaps solve them or answer them? Here's how that gets reflected in testing. So you're going to notice that this test is from 2008, and this is a test from the New England Common Assessment Program, which is sometimes called NECAP for short. It's a test that's been used by, it depends on what year we look at, but in the past, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island. And it's a well-vetted test. It was developed by Measured Progress. And this is a grade 4 level. Most states are testing at either grade 4 or grade 5, and then grade 8 and grade 11, give or take a year. If you're testing in grade 5, not grade 4, still think of this test as relevant to what your students would be potentially held accountable to. Now, Achieve has been pointing people towards this model simply because it's a model that was developed, it's been tested, it's normed. We understand how students react to it, and it's been proven to be a good indicator of students' content knowledge, skills, and even their systems thinking and ability to apply, sort of generalize, synthesize within a novel context. And so how does that really work? Well, what this model starts with is a scenario. So a fictional class, student, teacher, okay, but real life examples of birds. And now we come to a question, okay, which a teacher asks, which beak will pick up the most different kinds of food? So as a student, I look at the different kinds of beaks on the different kinds of birds. This fictional class is given different tools and different materials. Tools represent the beaks and the materials represent the food. Interesting, like a text feature. And then they are, in this particular, and this is interesting, in this particular standardized assessment, the students are actually given these materials in order to work with a partner and gather their own data in part one of the standardized assessment. And then part two, they take that data forward on their own and answer a series of questions. So they receive the actual materials for the investigation, but first they're asked to make a prediction on their own, okay, and to explain their prediction. So this is one of the areas where there's some kind of back and forth where people are saying, scientific, what we know as the scientific method is obsolete and so on and so forth. Lowercase s, lowercase m scientific method has always been and will always be relevant. That is a process for, or is not a singular, but is process for pursuing a question or a problem to an evidence-based solution. Capital S, capital M, a singular scientific process or a singular engineering design process is not reality. Depending on where you work and how you work and so on, you may have a different process. However, scientific and engineering process is logical, and also because it's a process, directional. And so when you look at something like this, when you see something like a prediction should have certain format to it. It should be testable, not an I think or I predict, because you can't test you. But in reality, it should be something which is either true or false, is something that may be supported or refuted with data potentially. And so in actuality, what they're asking for here is a hypothesis. Okay, so if you identify that as a hypothesis, you'd be right. And then guess what else pops up? A procedure. Now, this procedure is given to the students, but you can see this is a 13-step procedure. And, this is expected of fourth grade students, and it has actually been demonstrated by fourth grade students for years, since 2008. About 10 years, this testing has been in place and refined. Data tables, I mentioned earlier, okay, being able to format them, but not only format them, but actually able to put data into them in the proper places, and then render that data according to math practices, right? Titling, giving units along axes, making a bar graph appropriately, okay? So you can see here that from a singular scenario, which I'm going to back up to it, from this one scenario, we have already seen several elements of whether a student can develop a question or a hypothesis, whether they can follow a multi-step procedure or really use a model, whether they can gather data, whether they can analyze and use that data at one level, but actually on another level, further analysis is required in these different questions. Which type of bird beak was able to pick up the most different kinds of food? Use your data to support your answer. So can the student argue from evidence? Which bird beaks picked up the fewest kinds of food? Use your data to explain your answer. So they're asking not only in the positive, but also in the negative. Okay, can a student think in multiple directions? Based on what you've learned in your investigation, predict which food a bird with this type of beak would eat and explain why. Okay, so now they're going to have to generalize what that scenario and what they just learned through their experiment with the gathering data and look at this beak and then think about the shape of that beak. Is it more like a tweezer, more like a spoon, and so on? And then which type of food did those things pick up best? Okay, so explain that. Write a plan. So actually develop a model that Mr. Brown's class could use to follow and answer their question. Identify one thing in your plan that will stay the same. Is it a fair test? Is it a controlled experiment? Is basically what's being asked here. Okay, so I'm going to jump to, so that's just walking you through different parts around one scenario. And if you go to, again, look at KnowAtom.com/curriculum, you'll notice in the back of every of our units, we have something called a concept check, which follows this exact model. And we see this not only in the NECAP assessment, starting in 2007, 2008, way back, and continuing to this day, but we're seeing it in new assessments that are specifically developed for the next generation science standards in places like the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. So here's an example from 2016, not so long ago, grade 5, and you'll see fictional class going through a fictional procedure and trying to find out, looking at what they did, using specific materials and trying to find out something about beans and bean plants and how they grow and what influences them. Okay, so all of this is real life, fictional students, but everything else is real life, realistic, even the data up here. And then what happens is that based on this scenario, the student who's being tested in the 5th grade classroom is being asked whose claim is correct, because Trevor and Kayla came to different claims based on this evidence. Explain why Kayla or Trevor, have a claim that's correct or perhaps incorrect, and use evidence to support the claim. Where does the evidence come from? It comes from this data. Okay. Well, Trevor and Kayla don't just stop there. So that's one question. In the next question, next test item, the student being tested is asked to construct a food web by dragging and dropping different plants and animals into boxes. Okay, and then once they've done that, they're asked to explain how their model shows the shortest way for energy to get from a plant to a fox. And they could even add a sun in here, perhaps, so we could see how energy travels from the sun through a food chain and actually a food web. Okay, so you might be thinking about, well, we have computerized testing. It's not necessarily going to be hands-on testing. Well, guess what? This is all able to be done on a computer. All of this that I showed you is able to be done on a computer as well. So don't be, wowed by shiny things and think that your kids have to do everything on a computer. That's a joke. The reality is, can they think their way through this? Okay. If they can think through it on paper, dealing with the computer thing, is one thing. But the reality is, if they can't think about it on paper and you're trying to focus on some kind of computer resource to get them to drag and drop things into a box, it doesn't matter. If you don't drag it and drop it into the proper box because you understand where it belongs based on your ability to analyze the situation, your dragging and dropping won't matter otherwise if you can't do that. So if you look to the next item over here, Kayla's class was learning about different kinds of food chains. Her teacher shows the class the model of a pond food chain below. So food web over here, food chain specifically here. Look at the model of the pond food chain. Which of the following statements best describes the movement of matter in the pond food chain? Select 3 correct answers. So there's more than one. This isn't about selecting one answer anymore. It's about selecting all of the answers that are appropriate. And you notice you've got 6 potential, but 3 are correct. And the other piece is to use the model of the pond food chain to describe the relationship between the organisms in the food chain and the exchange of matter back into the environment. What is that saying? Well, once students have done their multiple choice, look back up here. How does the matter that's being transferred through here to the heron get back into the food chain for the algae? Well, how about the heron's droppings? How about something dies or falls back into that pond or leaches into the pond? What is the role of the bacteria in decomposing that material, making that matter available for the algae or for one of these other species, plants or animals, to bring back into that food chain? And then Trevor and Kayla go into more things. Well, how would that apply to things like composting and trash collection and so on? And then how would that sort of idea of our impact on the environment and rotting foods and so on and so forth, and the use of plastics versus organics, how could these sort of things inform us about the environment, not only food chains and food webs, but ecosystems? And when we think about the interaction between plants and animals and ecosystems, when we think about our role as humans in an environment where we deal with animals and plants, what could we do to deter things like common moles that might appear in a garden, especially if we have different criteria that we need to try to consider, things like safety, amount of work, costs, environmental impacts, the time required, the usefulness, okay? Which of the solutions that are available are best meted, are the best fit solution when you consider these 6 criteria, and use the evidence to support your claim. So this is all an example of how 3 dimensions are assessed, not just against one standard, but in clusters of standards in these new standardized tests. And if you look to Illinois, they also have an operational assessment, which really just borrows the items from DC. They have an item operational agreement there. So keep that in mind. The kind of testing that you have seen under traditional standards previously is not the kind of testing that's coming your way, because now students are required to master skills and therefore, and cross-cutting concepts, therefore they are tested. And this is how they're tested. Last bit, and then I'll leave you with this. Concrete steps you can take today to adjust teaching and learning expectations. I would recommend reading this book, Creating Cultures of Thinking. Number one thing I would say about these new standards and why administrators and teachers and students struggle is because they are not used to operating within a culture of thinking. And if students are being expected to think like scientists and engineers and to learn those skills, they need to learn them in an environment which requires those skills by design. And so if the adults in the room and in the team are not thinking the way scientists and engineers do, are not able to model that, are not able to coach that, then it's an immediate barrier. Okay, so I would recommend this book. And also from an administrative standpoint, if the idea is that you're going to walk into a classroom, have a standard on the board, and see kids listening, and that's the idea of the ideal classroom, that's not a culture of thinking. And it's actually, you can't have a standard on the board and have that be the only standard that's being taught that day. It doesn't work that way. This is not an environment that's about just listening. It's about thinking, listening with the intent of thinking about something and then implementing the thoughts. Another piece that I would recommend is taking a look at the National Research Council's implementation guide. And we have an annotated version available at KnowAtom.com/NRC, which walk you through the steps required in order to implement these new standards. And we've annotated that with recommendations for how to do this. Another piece is setting new expectations for students for what it means to learn well. Today you don't only have to get a book and start reading it. Look at some of the recommendations that step 1, what you need to do with your team and in your classroom to get down that road. But it's also about changing from saying something to actually requiring it and putting students in the seat to evaluate themselves and their peers. And so in the case of, and doing so in a formative sense. And so we co-developed this with a client of ours in Bayside, Wisconsin, and it's something that many of our clients use. This tool is a Socratic dialogue peer evaluation where in an inner circle, outer circle model, students are paired, and as the students on the inner circle are engaging in verbal Socratic dialogue, their partner in the outer circle, who is working in Socratic circle tools that we have online, in their own dialogue, is also documenting whether their partner is making contributions. Perhaps they are making connections to real world and personal experiences, which is the ultimate goal, or perhaps they're encountering stumbling blocks where their partner is making comments that were not relevant to the conversation topic, or putting down others' views, or interrupting or talking over other participants. And so this is set up like a rubric and helping students who are receiving the feedback to move towards their ultimate goal. And we have different point systems involved there too. And obviously the student who's the peer evaluator, and students switch halfway through, so everybody is, gets the turn to be evaluated and evaluator. They sit down with their peer and say, hey, look, here's why I gave you that. Here's some things you can improve. And we've seen very dramatic conversations and outcomes in a positive way. And a couple final slides, and I'll let you go. Another concrete step you can take is to recognize that that for a student, guessing what the teacher's looking for no longer works. Okay, if it does work, then your class is not a next generation science class. Guessing what the teacher wants on the fill in the blank, on the worksheet, on the ticket to leave, on the question that was asked in class, and don't set your class up for that. Okay, you can see this is a piece of photo stock. Right, this is the prototypical concept of an American elementary classroom. Okay, I would not put my children in this classroom. We're not looking for kids to all raise their hands with the one answer. What we're looking for is students to be able to argue from evidence, to not even have to raise a hand, but to be able to engage respectfully, politely, and to help to navigate a conversation, also pivot a conversation with those skills. Okay, so don't set your students up for guessing what you think. And that's obviously oftentimes what it is, what the teacher thinks is the right answer. In order to give students that release of responsibility and to have a kind of dynamic sort of Socratic environment where students are scientists and engineers, thinking and acting as scientists and engineers, as educators and as administrators, we need to trust the students and the teacher's ability to learn if given the opportunity. And so that requires the opportunity to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes and to consistently challenge and to adjust challenge within a class or even from one lesson to the next and one unit to the next. All year long, the level of challenge should be increasing as students develop new skills and new knowledge. You have to remember that challenge is a prerequisite to skill development. Okay, if there's no challenge, there's nothing to be learned, right? It's already known, it's already existing, and that's not the purpose of the classroom. Okay, the classroom is to learn something new. Another thing that we can do in the classroom today is to step back. Remember that students' performance depends entirely on the teacher and their willingness to release responsibility and to challenge the students beyond their current skill level. Angela Duckworth says in Grit that that gap between existing skill and the level of challenge is the opportunity for growth. And I honestly believe that. If there's no gap between what the student's current skill is and what we're requiring, then there's really nothing that they need to do differently, right? There's no opportunity to jump higher, to get over a challenge, then we don't jump higher, right? There's no attempt to jump higher. And so the skill and what we can actually perform just remains the same. So remember that that's true teacher to student and the way that environment works in the classroom, but it's also true of administrators. These standards are something significant for teachers and teams to take on. And if the administrator doesn't coach the teams, expect the team to productively struggle and acknowledge that that's okay but necessary, and doesn't look at teachers as willing and able to learn and adjusting the focus of that learning and that challenge within teams and within buildings and within districts, then what happens is that you will not have a culture of thinking, but you also will not have a culture that succeeds under these new standards because, quite frankly, if practices do not change and the challenge is not accepted and the students are not empowered, the teachers are not empowered to make mistakes, and the students are not empowered to make mistakes, and the sort of messiness that's required is not occurring, then what's going to happen is stagnation. And as the testing changes and the skills are required, students are going to struggle in a way that they can't, they can't produce because they haven't had a productive struggle prior to testing. They've only struggled in the test and therefore failed. And so that will be a failure not only for that student, unfortunately, and a negative experience, but it will be a failure for the classroom, in the school, in the district, and what ultimately becomes a systemic gap. And unfortunately, particularly with these, NGSS, teacher design resources, there's a lot of research around the fact that that they're not of the quality of district enacted resources. And that's not a knock on teachers. It's just it's a reality that, any one person can only do so many things really well. And when students are transient in a district, to move between one person's class and another in a building or so on and so forth, and constantly be getting different definitions and different experiences, or potentially learn the same thing all year long, is not helpful to them either. Okay, so this takes a lot of thought and a lot of willingness. And so I would leave you with this, that success under these standards relies on asking questions of yourself, of students, and of the resources that you're engaging. Not only ask those questions, but to engage in discussions and only consider tasks that require students to think. Okay? And by requiring yourself and your team and your students to think, and by enacting the resources that are designed specifically for these standards, specifically for the grade level you're teaching, and that are specifically articulated vertically and horizontally like KnowAtom does. And I'm just, again, throwing that out there because these are nuances that we find are often lost on people, but are very key to being a next generation effective resource, and why we're the gold standard. That needs to be your focus. And I would recommend another book to you here called Making Thinking Visible: How to Promote Engagement, Understanding, and Independence for All Learners. There's a DVD that comes with that, or if you download the Kindle version, you get a username and password. You can get this on Amazon. And take a look. Okay, Making Thinking Visible, those techniques, what you see is the kind of techniques, the kind of thinking, and the kind of independence that is not only applicable to ELA, social studies, and math, but absolutely necessary under these next generation science standards, which, if you're from a Common Core state, are very closely intertwined. So I will leave you with that. I would encourage you to take a look at the curriculum. If you find yourself in a position where your team is considering what to do next, how to enact the resources, trying to perhaps develop your own, trying to perhaps, turn old lesson plans into something that is appropriate for next generation science standards, whether you're in adaptive or adoptive state, California, Arkansas, Missouri, Massachusetts, wherever. We have been at this for an awfully long time. We have been developing curriculum for over 13 years, and our products are aimed at, are really developed for the next generation science standards in both adaptive and adoptive states. And it has taken us quite a while to get where we are. And we have a lot of really great data behind what we're doing to support that it's not only something that benefits some kids, but all children and all standards in all suburban, urban, and rural environments. And so regardless of your challenges, I would encourage you to take a look at these as examples. We have one unit and one student reader for each grade level, K through 8. We have full year, full scope and sequence materials, both curriculum, the online components, visuals, and the hands-on materials available for every day of the school year. Our model is based on 9 units, so there's sort of monthly themes with the exception of kindergarten, which has 3 units. And we have all the materials. We take care of all that for folks and everything. So if you are in a position where you have a curriculum team, or you're looking to enact something now or in the fall, give us a look. Give us a call if you have questions. We'd love to work with you. Like I said, we really, as teachers ourselves, appreciate the challenge that's involved in helping make the shift from traditional practice to next generation, and also to be able to deliver that instruction despite the skill set, the pedagogy involved, even if that's there to be able to deliver that at the level through curriculum and materials that's required. So that's where we set in. You can also stay connected with us on our blog. It's free, KnowAtom.com/blog. Keep connected with us on Facebook, Facebook.com/KnowAtom, or on Twitter @KnowAtom.com. And we have a ton of live and on-demand resources, which are free, ebooks, all kinds of stuff under KnowAtom.com/resources. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to email me or call our team here at fvigent, FVIGEANT, @KnowAtom.com, or 617-475-3475, extension 2018. Good luck in your quest, and thank you again for your time. I hope you found this helpful. If you'd like to see any resources from the webinar or anything that you may wonder about that we might provide you, please, again, reach out. We'll do our best to connect you. Thanks again, and have a great day. Bye-bye.